Tale of Tamlin, based on the old ballad and reel of Glasgow, retold by Lari and retold again by myself. Here we go. Once upon a time, a girl called Janet lived in the Scottish borderlands. Her father was the Laird of Carterhaugh, who owned many fields and hills and the beautiful Carterhaugh woods. Janet was allowed to walk in the fields and on the hills, but she wasn't allowed to walk into the woods. All the children of the borders were told the story of a boy called Tamlin, who had been stolen and captured by the fairies when out riding his horse when he fell in Carterhaugh woods. They were told the story of a fierce fairy knight who now guarded the woods for the fairy queen, and they were told never to go into the woods. But Janet didn't believe in fairy stories, and Janet didn't like being told what to do. So one bright day she crept out of the laird's house and strode into Carterhaugh woods. She walked through the tall trees. She nibbled ripe fruit and listened to tiny birds calling. She found a stone well with a rose bush growing beside it, and reached out to pick a late flower blooming on a thorny twig. The stem snapped, and Janet heard a voice above her. "The fairy queen won't like that." She looked up. A young man was sitting in a tree. "The fairy queen doesn't like people stealing fruit or flowers in her woods." "But these aren't her woods. These are my father's woods. Anyway, I don't believe in fairy queen or the fairy stories." The young man vanished out of the tree and appeared again standing in front of Janet. "Did you believe that?" Janet laughed. "Are you a fairy?" He smiled. "Yes." Tamlin and Janet proceeded to talk for hours upon hours, whereupon Tamlin seduced her and they fell in love. He told her to leave the woods and to never return. After her liaison with Tamlin, she returned home and shortly began showing signs of pregnancy. When her father confronted her about this, Janet refused to name the father, saying only that he is a fairy knight. She returned to Carterhaugh woods and meets again with Tamlin. When he appears, Tamlin reveals that he is not born of the fair folk, that he was stolen by the fairy queen when he was a boy. He confided in her the fear for his life, that this coming Hallows Eve, every 7 years, that one of their own is to be given as tithe, a sacrifice to hell from the fairy queen. Tamlin believes that this year he himself has been chosen. "You could escape," Janet pleads. "The fairy queen's magic is too strong for me to break on my own." "I would help you." "Why?" "I love you. I want you to be a father to our child, and because I believe the boy stolen by the fairy should be allowed to walk back out of the woods." Tamlin looked slowly round at the beautiful trees, the shining well, and he nodded. Then he whispered to Janet, telling her how to break the fairy queen's power over him. He tells her that she will recognise him by his white horse, and that she must pull him from his saddle and hold on to him and not let him go. He warns her that it will be a difficult task. The fairies will try to trick her and force her to let go, but he promised he would do her no real harm. Janet promised that she would free him, then left the woods. Once the bright Hallows Eve day turned to night, Janet slipped away from the party in the laird's house. She crept through the woods to the well and hid beside the rose bush. At midnight she heard the fairy queen's army marching through all the fairy queen's lands on Hallows night. A fairy knight rode past on a black horse, leading a line of fairy soldiers with bows and arrows. Another fairy knight rode past on a brown horse, leading a line of fairy soldiers with spears. Then Janet saw a white horse approach, ridden by Tamlin, who had one hand gloved and one hand bare. Janet remembered Tamlin's plan and her promise, and she knew that now was her chance to break the fairy queen's power. So she leapt up, grabbed Tamlin's bare hand and pulled him from his horse. A voice screeched from high above, "Let him go, girl! He is mine forever!" "No!" shouted Janet, and she wrapped her arms round Tamlin and held him tight. With one word, the Fairy Queen turned Tamlin into a snake. The snake hissed in Janet's face, but she didn't let go. The Fairy Queen turned Tamlin into a wildcat. The wildcat scratched Janet's arms, but she didn't let go. The Fairy Queen turned Tamlin into a swan. The swan's wings beat Janet's shoulders, but she didn't let go. The Fairy Queen turned Tamlin into a stag. The stag antlers bruised Janet's ribs, but she didn't let go. The Fairy Queen turned Tamlin into a wolf. The wolf snarled and growled and bit at Janet's sleeves, but she didn't let go. Finally, the Fairy Queen turned Tamlin into a burning branch. Janet remembered the plan and the promise, and Janet knew that she now held all the power, so she threw the burning branch into the well. The flame fizzled out. Tamlin climbed out of the water, dripping wet and laughing. The Fairy Queen screamed as her power over Tamlin drained away. The Fairy Queen was furious, angry at Janet for stealing her beautiful night. Despite her anger, there was nothing the Queen could do. Janet had won Tamlin's freedom. Janet and Tamlin ran out of the woods together. "Now do you believe in fairy stories?" asked Tamlin. "Yes, I do," Janet smiled. "Do you believe in happily ever after?" And so, the boy who had been stolen by the fairies and the girl who resisted the Fairy Queen married and raised their child together, leaving the woods behind them